A skeleton found under a car park in the city centre has now been confirmed as that of
mystery for
King Richard
500 years, and now scientists have confirmed that a skeleton found under a Leicester car park is that of King Richard
Council
III.
car park in Leicester are those of King Richard III, who died at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485.
It's a regular Tuesday morning in a city in England. Workers are about to tear up an old parking lot to make way for something new. And nobody, not a single person standing there with their hard hats and their coffee cups, has any idea that just a few feet below the cracked grey asphalt, one of the greatest mysteries in all of British history is about to be solved. A mystery that had gone unanswered for over 500 years. That's longer than the United States has even existed as a country. And in one single dig, with dirt still fresh on their shovels, a team of archaeologists and historians were about to change everything we thought we knew about a dead king, a lost grave, and one of the most controversial stories in the entire history of England. So buckle up, because this is the story of how King Richard III, a man who died in battle in 1485, whose body was buried and then forgotten, whose very name became linked to villainy and murder, was finally found beneath a parking lot in the city of Leicester, and how that discovery turned history upside down in the most spectacular way possible. Now, let's go back, way back, to the 15th century. Because to understand why finding Richard III was such a massive deal, you first need to understand who Richard III actually was, and why the world had basically forgotten where he was buried in the first place. Richard III was the King of England, and he ruled from 1483 until his death in 1485. That's only 2 years on the throne, one of the shortest reigns in English royal history. But don't let that fool you into thinking he wasn't important. Richard III might just be the most talked about, most debated, most controversial king England has ever had. And a huge part of that is because of one man who came along about 100 years after Richard died and wrote a play about him. That man was William Shakespeare. And Shakespeare's version of Richard III painted him as a twisted, scheming, evil villain. A hunchback who murdered his own nephews to steal the throne. This version of Richard became so famous, so deeply embedded in popular culture, that for centuries most people just assumed it was true. But here's the thing about history. It's complicated. And the real story of Richard III is far more interesting than any play. Richard was born on October 2nd, 1452, at Fotheringhay Castle in Northamptonshire, England. He was the youngest surviving son of Richard, Duke of York, and Cecily Neville. Growing up during the brutal civil war known as the Wars of the Roses, a long bloody conflict between two powerful royal families, the House of York and the House of Lancaster, Richard learned early that power was everything, and that you could lose it in an instant. His family fought on the Yorkist side, and when his older brother became King Edward IV, Richard was rewarded with titles, land, and military responsibility. He proved himself a capable soldier and a loyal supporter of his brother throughout years of political chaos and battlefield violence. But what Richard could never have predicted, what nobody could have predicted, was the chain of events that one death would set in motion. An event that would begin his rise to the throne and ultimately lead to his destruction. But then, Edward IV died unexpectedly in April 1483, and everything changed almost overnight. Edward left behind two young sons. Edward, aged 12, and Richard, aged 9. The older boy was set to become King Edward V, but before the coronation could happen, Richard, the boy's uncle, made his move. He had himself declared Lord Protector, took custody of the two princes, and placed them in the Tower of London, which at the time was a royal residence, not just a prison. Then, through political maneuvering and a declaration that his brother's marriage had been illegitimate, making the princes illegitimate too, Richard had himself crowned King of England in July 1483, and then something terrifying happened. The two young princes, The boys who should have been kings simply vanished. They were never seen in public again. To this day, nobody knows for certain what happened to them, but many historians believe they were murdered, and Richard III has always been the prime suspect. These boys became known as the Princes in the Tower, and their disappearance is one of the most haunting cold cases in the history of the world. So that's the backdrop. A king who came to power in controversial circumstances, who ruled for only 2 years, and whose legacy was shaped more by his enemies and by Shakespeare than by actual facts. And his end came just as dramatically as everything else in his life. In August 1485, a man named Henry Tudor landed in Wales with an army, ready to challenge Richard for the throne. On August 22nd, 1485, the two armies met at a place called Bosworth Field in Leicestershire. It was the last major battle of the Wars of the Roses, and it would decide the fate of England. Richard didn't run. He charged directly at Henry Tudor in a bold cavalry attack, trying to end the battle by killing his rival personally. He almost made it, but his men were betrayed. The Stanley brothers, Thomas Lord Stanley and his brother Sir William, switched sides at the critical moment, and Richard found himself surrounded. He was cut down, becoming the last English king to die in battle. He was 32 years old. After the battle, Henry Tudor became King Henry VII, the first of the Tudor dynasty. And what happened to Richard's body tells you everything about how quickly history can be rewritten by the winners. Richard's body was stripped naked and thrown over the back of a horse, displayed publicly for 2 to 3 days to prove he was dead, and then buried in a simple grave at Greyfriars Church in Leicester, a friary founded by Franciscan monks. There was no grand royal funeral, no magnificent tomb, no monument to mark the spot. Just a simple burial in a church that most people had already started to forget. And then things got even worse for Richard's memory. In 1538, King Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries as part of his break from the Catholic Church. Greyfriars Friary was closed, its buildings sold off and repurposed, and Richard's grave was essentially abandoned. A column was later said to mark the spot, but over the centuries, even that disappeared. The city of Leicester grew and changed around the old friary site. Buildings were torn down and rebuilt. Streets were rerouted. And eventually a parking lot was paved right on top of what had once been the church's choir, the most sacred part of the building. Right on top of where Richard III had been sleeping in the ground for 500 years. So here we are, a king lost to history, buried under a parking lot. And for a long time, most historians thought that was the end of the story. Searching for a specific grave in a medieval church that no longer existed, under a modern city, seemed like an impossible task. Like looking for a single grain of sand on a beach. But then came Philippa Langley. And Philippa Langley was not the kind of person who accepts impossible. Philippa was a screenwriter and a member of the Richard III Society, a group of people dedicated to re-examining Richard's life and giving him a fairer hearing than Shakespeare had. She had become convinced through years of research that Richard had received a deeply unfair reputation, and she was equally convinced that his grave could be found. She wasn't a professional archaeologist. She wasn't a university professor. She was a passionate, determined researcher with an idea that most experts thought was a long shot. She partnered with the University of Leicester, which agreed to lead the archaeological dig. And after years of planning, fundraising, and overcoming institutional skepticism, the project was finally approved. The dig would take place in the Social Services car park on New Street in Leicester. The exact location that historical records suggested was the most likely site of the old Greyfriars Friary. On August 25th, 2012, the dig began, and nobody, not even Philippa Langley, who had fought years for this moment, was prepared for what was about to happen next. A small team of archaeologists started carefully removing the tarmac and the soil beneath it, working slowly and methodically, cataloguing everything they found. And then, within just 6 hours of breaking ground, on that very same first day, they found something. Buried just below the surface, they uncovered fragments of medieval tile. Then wall foundations, then more tile. The building was right where the research said it would be. The choir, the most likely burial spot, was right there beneath the parking lot. And still on that extraordinary first day, August 25th, 2012, just hours into a dig that was supposed to last 2 full weeks, came a discovery that stopped every single person in that trench completely cold. In an area toward the southern end of the choir, a brush swept back the soil and revealed something unmistakable. Human bones, leg bones, first emerging from the earth one piece at a time. And as the team continued, more of the skeleton came into view. Not just any bones, a spine with a pronounced and distinctive curve. Arm bones, leg bones. The remains of a human being buried without a coffin, without grave goods, in what appeared to be a hastily dug and somewhat cramped grave. The feet were missing, possibly cut by later construction. But the rest of the skeleton was remarkably well preserved. Over the following days, the skeleton was carefully and fully excavated. The entire process completed by September 5th, 2012, when the remains were finally lifted from the ground and prepared for transport. But the discovery itself, that had happened in the first few hours. The ground had given up its secret almost immediately, as if 500 years of waiting had been enough. And that curved spine, that was the detail that made everyone go very quiet and very focused all at once. Here's where science comes in, and it is absolutely fascinating. The skeleton was carefully removed and taken to the University of Leicester for analysis. Immediately the team could see this was the skeleton of a male, probably in his late 20s to late 30s. There were multiple wounds visible, injuries consistent with death in battle. And then there was the spine. The skeleton showed a significant sideways curvature, a condition called scoliosis. Not the dramatic, grotesque hunchback Shakespeare described, but a real, medically significant spinal curvature that would have made one shoulder appear higher than the other. Now, here was the question the whole world was waiting to have answered. Was this actually Richard III? Finding the right church, in the right location, with a male skeleton of the right age and a curved spine was remarkable. But was it enough? The answer was no, not yet. They needed more proof. And this is where modern science did something that would have seemed like pure magic to anyone living in the 15th century. They decided to use DNA analysis. To run a DNA test on a 500-year-old skeleton, you need something to compare it to. A living relative who shares genetic material with the person you're testing. Researchers traced Richard III's family tree down through the female line. Because mitochondrial DNA, passed from mothers to children, is the most reliable type for this kind of test. And eventually found 2 living descendants of Richard's sister, Anne of York. One was a Canadian-born man named Michael Ibsen, a cabinet maker living in London, whose ancestry could be traced directly back through the female line to Anne of York. The other was a woman named Wendy Doldig. Both agreed to provide DNA samples. The mitochondrial DNA extracted from the skeleton's teeth and bones was compared to the samples from Michael and Wendy. And the result? It was a match. The DNA from the skeleton matched the DNA from Richard III's living descendants. The chances of this being a coincidence were extraordinarily small. Combined with everything else, the location, the age of the individual, the sex, the spinal condition, the battle wounds, the evidence was simply overwhelming. On February 4th, 2013, the University of Leicester held a press conference watched by millions of people around the world. The lead archaeologist, Richard Buckley, stepped to the microphone and delivered one of the most remarkable sentences in the history of science and archaeology. Beyond reasonable doubt, the individual identified as Skeleton 1 from the Greyfriars dig was indeed Richard III, King of England. The room erupted. Social media exploded. news outlets around the world ran the story as their top headline. A king who had been lost for 528 years had been found, not in some grand cathedral, not in a secret vault, not by professional treasure hunters, but in a parking lot, by a determined woman who refused to give up, and a team of scientists who let the evidence speak for itself. It was the kind of discovery that only happens once in a generation, maybe once in a lifetime, but the story doesn't end there. Because now that they had found Richard III, the question became, what do you do with him? Where does a king get reburied? This became a subject of considerable debate and even legal controversy. Leicester Cathedral claimed the right to host his reburial. Some members of the Richard III Society argued that Richard should be reburied in York, the city he had the strongest personal connection to during his lifetime. There were court challenges, petitions, and passionate arguments on all sides. In the end, after legal proceedings that went to the Court of Appeal, the decision was upheld that Richard III would be reinterred at Leicester Cathedral. A magnificent new tomb was designed. A simple, elegant raised sarcophagus of Swaledale fossil stone, topped with a carved letter R for Richard. A processional route was planned through the streets of Leicester, allowing thousands of people to pay their respects as the coffin made its way to the cathedral. In March 2015, it happened. Over 3 days, a series of events were held to mark the reinterment of Richard III. His coffin, handcrafted from English oak and yew by cabinet maker Michael Ibsen, the very man whose DNA had helped confirm the king's identity, was carried through the streets of Leicester in a solemn procession. Thousands of people lined the route. Many wore the white rose of York. Some were in tears. On March 26, 2015, Richard III was finally laid to rest in Leicester Cathedral, with a full religious ceremony attended by senior members of the church, historians, politicians, and members of the public. Sophie, Countess of Wessex, represented the British royal family. It was a moment that felt genuinely historic, not performed or staged, but real and deeply moving. A king who had been dismissed, forgotten, buried under concrete, and dragged through centuries of bad reputation was finally being treated with the dignity that every human being deserves. And that brings us to what might be the most important part of this whole story. Not just the discovery itself, but what it changed. Because finding Richard III didn't just give archaeologists a new skeleton to study. It opened up a whole new conversation about who Richard really was, and whether the story we'd been told for 5 centuries was actually true. The forensic analysis of his bones revealed a great deal. He was a physically active man. The development of his arm bones suggests he trained extensively with weapons from a young age, as a medieval knight would. He was not the frail, broken figure that Shakespeare described. His scoliosis was significant but would not have prevented him from fighting. He died in active combat, charging his enemy on horseback. He was about 5 feet 8 inches tall, which was average to slightly above average for a man of his era. Isotope analysis showed that in the years before his death, he had been eating extremely well. Rich food, lots of protein, the diet of someone living a very privileged royal lifestyle. And the wounds. The battle wounds on his skeleton told a story of a man who died fighting hard. 11 separate injuries were identified on the bones, 9 of them on the skull alone, consistent with blows received after his helmet was knocked off or removed. 1 large wound at the base of the skull was most likely the fatal blow. There were also what researchers described as humiliation injuries, wounds inflicted after death, when his body was already on the ground, consistent with historical accounts of what happened to him after the Battle of Bosworth. History, in this case, matched the bones remarkably closely. So what does all of this mean? Why does it matter that we found a king who died in 1485? It matters for several reasons. First, it matters because it's a reminder that history is never finished. We think we know the story, we think the books have been written and the conclusions have been reached, and then the ground opens up and shows us something that changes everything. Richard III was a real person, not just a villain in a play, not just a name in a history book, but a living, breathing human being who trained with weapons, ate well, had a curved spine, made difficult choices, and died on a battlefield at the age of 32. Finding his bones made him real again in a way that no amount of reading ever quite could. Second, it matters because of what it says about the power of ordinary people with extraordinary dedication. Philippa Langley wasn't handed this discovery by some great institution. She fought for it. She was told it was impossible, impractical, a waste of time and money. She pushed anyway. And because she did, one of the greatest archaeological discoveries of the modern era happened. That is genuinely inspiring, and it's a reminder that passion and persistence can move mountains, or at least parking lots. Third, and perhaps most profoundly, it matters because it forces us to ask hard questions about how history gets written and who gets to write it. Richard III was turned into a monster by people who had every political reason to paint him that way. The Tudor dynasty that replaced him needed him to be the villain so they could be the heroes. Shakespeare, writing under Tudor rule, gave that narrative a permanent and unforgettable artistic form. And for 500 years, that version stuck. But the bones in the ground don't lie. They don't have a political agenda. They don't care who's in power or who needs to be made to look good. They just are. And what they told us is that Richard III was a complex human being who deserves a far more nuanced and honest examination than history ever gave him. Was he a murderer? We still don't know for certain. Was he the twisted monster of Shakespeare's imagination? Almost certainly not. Was he a man of his time, operating in an incredibly brutal political environment, making choices that were sometimes terrible, but always deeply human? Almost certainly yes. The discovery of Richard III beneath that Leicester parking lot is one of those stories that reminds you why history matters, why science matters, and why it's always worth asking questions that everyone else has given up on. A city council parking lot became an archaeological site. A DNA test connected a Canadian cabinet maker to a medieval king. A curved spine beneath the tarmac reignited a 500-year-old debate. And a woman who simply refused to stop believing finally got to see a king come home. From the chaos and violence of the Wars of the Roses, to the humiliation of Bosworth Field, to the cold darkness under a parking lot, to the warm light of Leicester Cathedral, the journey of Richard III is one of the most extraordinary stories that history has ever produced. And we're still learning from it. Researchers are still studying his bones, still running tests, still pulling new information from the remains of a man who lived and died more than 5 centuries ago. Every new piece of data adds another layer to a story that we thought was finished, but turns out to be very much alive. History has a way of doing that, of refusing to stay buried. So the next time you walk through a city, past parking lots and office buildings and ordinary streets, remember this: you might be walking over something incredible. Something that has been waiting for 500 years, just beneath your feet, for someone curious enough and brave enough to look. Because that's what this story is really about. It's about looking. It's about asking questions when everyone else has moved on. It's about the moment when the ground gives up its secrets, and the past reaches up through the centuries and grabs you by the hand. Richard III waited 528 years for the world to find him again. If this story amazed you or changed how you see history, give it a like and share it with someone who loves a good mystery. There's plenty more waiting on this channel. And if you want your mind blown, check out the next video on what happens when the world runs out of oil. See you there.